The cold came off the Appalachians that November like something with a grudge. It moved through the valley in sheets, pushing dead leaves across the gravel road that led to what used to be Roy Calder's property, though it wasn't his anymore. Hadn't been for 6 weeks. 6 weeks since the papers were signed. Since the lock was changed on the front door of the house his father built with his own hands in 1961. Since his daughter-in-law handed him a garbage bag with some clothes in it and said, "We'll send the rest." They never sent the rest. Roy stood at the edge of the county road with a canvasback over one shoulder and a dog at his heel. The dog was a Belgian Malinois named Storm, 8 years old, gray around the muzzle, still carrying himself like he had somewhere important to be. They'd been together since Roy pulled him out of a crate at a rescue outside of Asheville, 3 years after Roy came home from his second tour. The woman at the rescue said Storm had been a military working dog, washed out of the program for being too bonded to one handler. The handler had been killed overseas. Storm hadn't eaten for 11 days after. Roy looked at the dog for a long moment, then he said, "Same." He paid the adoption fee, and they drove home together in silence, and that was that. Now home was a sleeping bag in the back of a 2003 Ford pickup with a cracked taillight and $47 in the center console. Roy was 64 years old. He had a Purple Heart in a shoebox, a plate in his left shoulder from Fallujah, and a son named Dennis who had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness and had spent the last 2 years convincing Roy to sign the farm over. Just to protect the asset, Dad, it's a tax thing. Roy had believed him. That was the part that kept him up at night. Not the cold, not the bag of clothes, not even the farm itself. The 112 acres his father had cleared by hand. The pond where Roy caught his first base at age 7. The barn where he'd hidden when his parents fought and where he later hid when his own marriage started to fracture. Not even the oak tree out back where his wife Carol had asked to have her ashes scattered. And where Roy had knelt in the dirt on a Thursday morning in April and done exactly that alone, because Dennis hadn't been able to make it. Prior engagement, he'd said. The thing that kept Roy up was simpler than all of that. It was this. He had believed his son. He had sat at the kitchen table with a notary public and sign his name on a document he didn't fully understand, because Dennis had explained it in a tone of patient condescension that made Roy feel like arguing would prove he was losing his mind. And Roy had thought, maybe I am. Maybe I'm old and slow and this is what love looks like now. People managing things on your behalf. He was wrong about that. He'd been wrong about a lot of things. He'd been right about Storm. The dog pressed against his leg in the cold, and Roy reached down without looking and put his hand on the back of Storm's neck, the way he always did, the way that meant I know. I'm here. We're okay. He wasn't sure that last part was true anymore. He found the storage auction by accident. He'd been parked outside a diner in a town called Millhaven, 40 miles east of his old property, eating a gas station sandwich in the cab of his truck, with Storm watching him with focused attention. There was a flyer under his windshield wiper. He almost threw it out. Then Storm put his paw on Roy's knee, which the dog only did when he wanted Roy to pay attention to something, and Roy unfolded the paper. Lien sale. Public auction. Saturday 9 a.m. Millhaven Self-Storage, Route 11. Units sold as is, cash only. Roy had $61 by then. He spent 11 of it on coffee and a bag of dog food that morning. He went to the auction because he had nowhere else to be. The storage facility sat at the end of a gravel lot behind a tire shop that had been closed for years. There were maybe 12 people gathered when Roy arrived. Pickers mostly, men with bidder numbers and flashlights, and the experienced patience of people who did this for a living. Roy stood at the back with Storm and watched. The first 3 units sold fast. Nothing remarkable. Furniture, boxes, the ordinary archaeology of someone else's abandoned life. Roy kept his hands in his pockets. Then they opened Unit 14. Even from 30 feet back, Roy could smell it before he could see it. Not rot, not mildew. Something older than that. Something that reminded him, and he couldn't explain why, of the armory at Camp Lejeune. gun oil and canvas and time. The unit was floor to ceiling, packed with the kind of deliberate military precision you don't see often. Wooden crates stenciled in black, metal trunks with combination locks, filing boxes sealed with packing tape that had yellowed and cracked. A green canvas tarp covered something bulky in the back corner, something about 4 feet tall and wider than it looked like it should be. Storm sat down. Roy knew what that meant. In another life, the life before the farm, before Carol, before Dennis, Roy had worked dog handling for 18 months. He knew what it meant when a dog with Storm's background and temperament chose to sit. It wasn't fear. It wasn't uncertainty. It was attention. Something here, the dog was saying. Something that matters. The auctioneer was moving fast. Unit 14, who'll start me at 200? The pickers shifted. A few flashlights swept the interior. Roy saw the man to his left heavyset, wearing a Carhartt jacket, the kind of picker who bought everything and sorted later, start to raise his paddle. Roy had $50. 50, he said. The auctioneer looked at him. Sir, starting bid is 200. I know. I'm offering 50. A few people laughed. The Carhartt man looked at Roy with something between amusement and irritation. The auctioneer opened his mouth. And then Storm stood up, walked 3 steps forward to the end of his leash, and barked once. Just once. Clear and flat like a period at the end of a sentence. Everyone looked at the dog. Fine, the auctioneer said, in the way that men say fine when they've decided the situation is beneath their dignity. $50. Anyone else? No one else bid. Roy didn't know if it was because no one wanted the unit badly enough to outbid a stubborn old man with a serious-looking dog, or if something else had shifted in the lot, some collective instinct that said let him have it. He didn't care either way. He counted out $50 in 5s and 10s, signed the paperwork with a borrowed pen, and was handed a key. He stood in front of Unit 14 alone. Storm sat beside him. All right, Roy said. Let's see what you found. It took him 3 hours to get through the outer layer. The wooden crates held tools. Good ones, military surplus still in original wrapping. Hand planes, chisels, draw knives, leather punches. The kind of tools a man bought once and passed down. Roy set them aside carefully. The filing boxes held paper. Decades of paper. Letters in rubber-banded bundles, photographs. Documents with government letterheads. Roy didn't read any of it that first day. He stacked it in the bed of his truck and kept moving. Behind the second row of crates, he found something that stopped him. It was a footlocker. Army issue, the old kind. Dark green, stenciled with a name that had been partially sanded off. He could make out the first letter, H. Below the name, a service number. Below that, a unit designation he recognized because he had served in a connected unit, decades later, on the other side of 2 different wars. Roy sat down on a crate and looked at the footlocker for a while. Storm put his head in Roy's lap. Yeah, Roy said. I know. The combination lock was a 3-digit military spec model. Roy tried the obvious sequences first. None of them worked. He didn't force it. He set it aside and went back to the tarp in the corner. What was under the tarp was a workbench. Not just any workbench. A woodworker's bench. Heavy maple, hand-built, with a leg vise on the left side and a row of wooden holdfasts that had been carved by someone who knew what they were doing. The bench was old but not neglected. The wood had been oiled. The vise moved smoothly. Someone had cared for this thing the way you care for a living thing, and then at some point had covered it with a tarp and walked away. Roy ran his hand along the surface. There was a mark in the wood near the right end of the bench, not carved, burned. A small rectangle, maybe 2 inches by 1 inch, with a name inside it. Hester, Callaway, Craftaman, USMC Ret. Roy pulled out his phone and searched the name. He found an obituary from the Millhaven Courier dated 19 months ago. Harold Hester Callaway, age 81, Korean War veteran, USMC, retired master woodworker, survived by 1 daughter who resides out of state. No services listed. The obituary was 4 sentences long, 4 sentences. Roy read it 3 times. 4 sentences for 81 years. 4 sentences for Korea and woodworking and whatever else this man had been. He thought about what his own obituary would say. He thought about Dennis. He thought about Carol's ashes under the oak tree on land that wasn't his anymore, and he decided not to think about Dennis anymore that day. He slept in the unit that night. He'd done worse. He laid his sleeping bag between the crates and the workbench, and Storm curled up against his side, and Roy listened to the tin roof expand and contract in the cold, and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill he'd developed in the Marines and refined in the years since. The next morning he tried the footlocker again. He'd been thinking, overnight, about the unit designation on the lid, about the way numbers worked in the military, about the things men chose when they needed a number they wouldn't forget. He tried the last 3 digits of the service number. The lock opened. Inside the footlocker, folded in a piece of unbleached muslin, were 3 things. The first was a Bronze Star citation. Harold Hester Calloway, Corporal, for actions during the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. The citation was specific in the way military citations are specific: coordinates, time, names of men whose lives were preserved because of what Calloway had done. Roy read it slowly. He had known men like this. He had been adjacent to moments like this, in different wars, in different cold. He knew what the language meant, and he knew what it was hiding, the way all military language hides the weight of the actual thing. The second was a photograph. 2 young men in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, squinting into the sun. On the back in pencil, Hester and Raymond, Pendleton, 1951. One of them was laughing. The other, Roy assumed Hester, was not, but there was something in his face that was better than laughing. A kind of steady happiness, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. The third was a letter, handwritten on 3 pages of lined paper, addressed to anyone who finds this, and dated 11 years ago. Roy made a cup of instant coffee on his camp stove, and sat on the workbench and read it. The letter took Roy 20 minutes to read, not because it was long, but because he kept stopping. Calloway wrote the way men of his generation wrote letters, plain, exact, without decoration. He had been, the letter explained, a craftsman for 53 years. He had built furniture, cabinets, doors, staircases. He had built a house with his own hands on 8 acres outside Millhaven. He had been married for 41 years to a woman named Ruth, who had died of cancer in 2003. They had 1 daughter, Sylvia, who had moved to Phoenix in 1998 and called on holidays and had not visited once since Ruth's funeral. When Calloway's health began to decline, he wrote, Sylvia had arranged, from a distance on the phone, without asking him, to sell the house and the 8 acres. She had explained that she couldn't manage the property from Arizona. She had explained it in the tone of patient condescension that Roy recognized immediately. The tone that means this is decided, I'm just informing you. Calloway had been moved to a facility in Millhaven. He had been allowed to bring some things. The rest, the tools, the woodworking bench, the decades of paper and photographs, had been put in storage under an arrangement. Sylvia had set up a prepaid rental that, according to the letter, was supposed to be maintained. It hadn't been. I put this letter here, Calloway wrote, because I know that eventually someone will open this locker. Could be my daughter, could be a stranger. Either way, I want someone to know the truth of what's in here, because the truth of a man's life is in what he made, and what he saved and what he chose to keep, not in what other people decide to say about him when he's gone. I built things for 50 years. I tried to be good at it. I tried to be honest. I want someone to know that I was here, and that I was careful with my work. If you're a picker, sell what you can. I don't mind. These are good tools, and they deserve to be used. If you're something else, if you found this, and it means something to you, then do whatever you need to do. I can't tell you what that is. I just know that some people are supposed to find certain things. The bench is the best thing I ever made. It took me a year. I want it to go somewhere it'll be used. That's all. H. Calloway. Roy folded the letter carefully and put it back in the muslin. Storm was watching him from the doorway of the unit. Roy looked at the dog for a long moment. Then he looked at the bench, the hand-oiled maple, the fitted vise, the burned mark in the corner. Hester Calloway, U.S. MC, Yeah, Roy said. I know what we have to do. It took him 2 weeks to find Sylvia. He wasn't trying to punish her. He wasn't trying to confront her. He simply felt, in the way he felt certain things, the way 22 years of military service had given him a sense of what needed to be done and in what order, that the letter was not his to keep to himself. He found her through the obituary. The funeral home that had placed the 4-sentence notice still had a contact on file. He explained, simply, that he had purchased a storage unit that had belonged to her father, and that he had found some personal items he thought she should know about. She called him back the next day. Her voice was guarded, in the way of someone expecting to be blamed for something. Roy recognized that too. Mr. Calder, she said, I'm not sure what my father may have left behind, but I want you to know that the storage arrangement was supposed to be handled. I'm not calling about the arrangement, Roy said. I'm calling because your father left a letter, and a Bronze Star citation, and a photograph of himself as a young man, and a workbench that he spent a year building. Silence on the line. I thought you should know, Roy said, that's all. More silence. Was he? Sylvia stopped, started again. Was he angry? In the letter? Roy looked at the letter in his hand. No, he said. He was clear, there's a difference. Sylvia came to Millhaven 10 days later. She drove from the airport in a rental car and met Roy at the storage unit on a Tuesday morning. And she was smaller than Roy had expected and older looking. And she stood in the doorway of the unit for a long time without speaking. Roy had laid the 3 items from the footlocker on top of the workbench. The citation, the photograph, the letter. Sylvia picked up the photograph first. She looked at it for a long time. She turned it over and read the penciled names on the back. He never talked about Korea, she said. Not once. Most of them didn't, Roy said. She set the photograph down and picked up the citation. She read it slowly. Roy watched her face change as she read, the way it changes when you realize something about a person that reorders everything you thought you knew. He was always just my father, she said. It was not a simple sentence. It had weight in it. Yes, Roy said. She put the citation down and looked at the bench. He built this, made the vise himself. Fitted the leg. The holdfast design is his. I looked it up. It's not standard. He modified it. Sylvia put her hand on the surface. I didn't know he did woodworking, she said. I mean, I knew, but I didn't. She stopped. I didn't know it was like this. Most people don't know what their parents were, Roy said. Not really. Not until it's too late to ask. He hadn't meant it as an accusation. He wasn't sure she took it that way. She was quiet for a while, her hand still on the bench. What are you going to do with all of it? She asked. That's up to you. The letter is yours, citation, the photograph, the tools. I thought I'd donate them to the vocational program at the high school. They're good tools, they should be used. And the bench? Roy looked at the bench. I thought, he said carefully, that if you didn't want it, if you couldn't take it to Phoenix, I might keep it. I used to do some woodworking. I have a place I'm working on getting. He said that last part steadily, as if it were true. He was working on it being true. Sylvia looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Storm, who was sitting in the corner being invisible the way well-trained dogs know how to be. Is that your dog? He is? Military? He was. He came home with me. She nodded slowly. She looked back at the bench. Keep it, she said. He'd want it used. Roy didn't go back to the county road where the farm used to be his. There was nothing there for him anymore. Not the oak tree, not the pond, not the barn, not the version of himself that had trusted his son and signed the papers. That man was gone. He wasn't sure what was in his place yet, but he was working on finding out. What he had was this: a truck, a dog, a storage unit full of good tools, a workbench made by a careful man, and a Bronze Star citation he'd had framed and mailed to the Veterans Museum in Asheville with a note explaining who Harold Hester Calloway was, because 4 sentences was not enough. He had something else too, though it was harder to name. The morning after Sylvia left, Roy had sat on the workbench with his coffee and his dog, and looked at the tools laid out in the unit, and thought about the letter. The truth of a man's life is in what he made, and what he saved, and what he chose to keep. He'd been thinking about it since the moment he read it, turning it over the way you turn a stone that you keep finding in your pocket. He was 64 years old. He had 2 tours, a Purple Heart, a dead marriage, a son he no longer trusted, and $50 left in the world the day he walked into that auction. He had Storm. He had the tools of a man who had also come home from a Cold War and spent 50 years making things with his hands and never talked about any of it, and who had written a letter at the end saying, "I was here and I was careful." Roy could do that. He didn't know yet where he would do it. The storage unit wasn't a long-term answer, and the truck got cold at night, and his shoulder ached in ways that had been getting worse for 3 years. But he had learned, in the Marines and again in the years since, that you don't need to know the full plan. You need to know the next step. Everything after that comes from doing the next step right. The next step was the tools. He spent a week cataloging them, cleaning the ones that needed it, wrapping them in oiled cloth. He called the vocational teacher at the high school, a woman named Mrs. Dupree, who had a voice like someone who had spent 30 years getting 16-year-olds to pay attention and had made her peace with the difficulty of that work. He explained what he had. She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Calder," she said, "can I ask where you got these?" He told her about Callaway, about the 4-sentence obituary, about the bench. She was quiet again. "Bring them in," she said. "Please." He brought them in on a Friday. 8 students helped him carry the crates. Mrs. Dupree unpacked each piece and held it up and talked about what it was and how it worked. And Roy stood in the back of the shop classroom and watched. And Storm sat beside him and was good. One of the students, a boy, maybe 16, with the careful, focused look of someone who was not good at school but was very good at things school didn't usually measure, picked up one of the hand planes and turned it over slowly. "Who made these?" he asked. "Marine," Roy said. "Korea. Came home and spent 50 years building things." The boy looked at the plane. Then he looked at Roy. "Are you a veteran?" "Yeah." "Did you build things too?" Roy thought about the barn, about the porch railing he'd replaced the summer before Carol got sick, about the window frames he'd fitted by hand in the back bedroom, taking his time, getting it right. "I used to," he said. "I'm thinking about starting again." The boy nodded, like that made sense, like there was nothing unusual about a man deciding at 64 to start again. Roy appreciated that. Young people sometimes understood things that older ones had decided to stop believing. He drove back to the storage unit that afternoon, in the thin winter light, Storm Ride-Eye shotgun, and he sat in the cab for a while before going in. The lot was quiet. The tire shop next door was dark. The trees at the edge of the property had gone bare. He thought about Dennis. He thought about it for exactly as long as it took him to find the thing he'd been looking for. The thing underneath the anger and the shame of having been fooled by his own son. He found it, finally, and it was this. Dennis had made his choices, and Roy had made his, and the farm was gone, and that was true. And the oak tree was still there, even if the land wasn't his, and Carol would have understood, because Carol had always understood that the things that mattered couldn't be signed away. "You can't deed the important things," she'd told him once. He couldn't remember the context. He remembered the words. He got out of the truck. Storm got out behind him and walked to the door of the unit and looked back over his shoulder, waiting. "All right," Roy said. "Let's get to work." The cold was still there. The mountain cold, the kind that settles in for months and doesn't apologize for itself. But inside the unit there was the smell of oiled wood and clean tools, and something that Roy recognized, slowly, as the smell of a thing that could still be built. He rolled up his sleeves. Storm found his corner, and Roy Calder, 64 years old, 2 tours, 1 Purple Heart, 1 broken trust, 1 dog who had come home from a different war and learned to stay. Roy Calder put his hands on the workbench that another careful man had made, and he began.